In this lesson, we'll learn the fastest way to do a render setup and to add an override material. Remember, the process that we're taking right now is to create the stage for ourselves so that we can actually create an environment that is renderable before we actually start modeling. So a little bit of this workflow is going to be quite contradictory to most of the other workflows that I may have shown in the other courses that have been out on Digital Tutors. So first, what I would usually do is to finish all the modeling, get everything quite neat and ready, and then to show you the material and render setup. Here we're going to be doing everything back to forward, and this may be more realistic in a typical office scenario. So let's go into our render setup. Let's hit F10 on the keyboards. And that's going to bring up our render setup window. Now I'm going to go through it page by page, but I'm only going to be flying through the most important things so that we only do what is absolutely necessary. Remember, we're trying to cut out all of the time-consuming things, and we're trying to get this done in the least amount of steps possible. So first of all, output size is the first one that I like to adjust. Generally, I want to make sure that I get the aspect ratio correct and then lock it down. So if you want to work with a typical video size, you can use 1024 by 720. You can then lock that in, and then you can increase this incrementally to any size you want, even an arbitrary 1600 by 1125, and you will know that your aspect ratio will always stay locked. So that is quite crucial to get that right. Next, in our V-Ray tab, I generally uncheck anti-aliasing. In my global switches, I will leave most of it on. I will just uncheck the filter maps to make sure that everything renders with as little complicated settings. Then I will go down into my V-Ray environment. I will turn on the GI and reflection. In color mapping, you just need to check subpixel mapping, and then you can move on. In the indirect illumination tab, go ahead and turn on your GI. I generally like to use irradiance and then light cache. This I would use for most of my indoor and outdoor settings. I just tend to prefer using one single setup for everything. Get to know your setup well, and then always just reuse it again and again once you get comfortable with it, instead of always having a different method that may be better for certain applications, but it's going to slow you down unless you have a good routine set in place. The preset, since we're getting started out, keep everything to low, show your calculation phase, and then down here below you want to then set up your light cache. Open that up, and we're going to drop the subdivisions to half, and we're going to increase the sample size just to make everything render quickly. We'd like to see the calculation phase here, and we're going to turn off all filtering in that section. Next, in our settings, I'm going to make sure that this is quite high. If you are really in a hurry and you want to see very rough renders, you can drop your subdivision multiplier to half. Remember that everything will look very grainy and blotchy, and then just remember to turn it back up to 1. Also, it's quite a good idea not to try and fiddle with too many of the figures that are in your V-Ray setup, in case you forget which ones you've touched and then you don't know how to get back to the defaults if you've gone too far. So I generally will only adjust this one and the noise threshold within this entire section. Then down here, the only one I keep adjusted is the dynamic memory limit. You want to basically have this at about 60 to 80% of the installed RAM on your machine. So for example, if you have 16 gigs, you may have 10 to 12 or so gigs in here. So let's just put in 10 there. Then the last thing that I like to have done, besides turning off the V-Ray log window if you have no errors, is adjusting the region sequence. Generally, I'll keep this on top to bottom or left to right. So lastly, render elements. I only keep this on way later in the process. So for now, I'm not going to worry about any of that. I just want to get a single image rendered out and get it in the fastest time possible. So also I'm going to drop this down to about 900 for now, or let's even go down to 720 by 506. So once that is done, the other thing that I'd like to mention in this lesson still is to use the override material. Before I go and waste any time on complicated materials, I would like to generally test out my cameras and lights with a basic override material that is a medium gray color. So let's hit M on our keyboards, bring up the material editor, and we're going to set up our first V-Ray material for this course. So go ahead and double click on V-Ray material. This one is going to be called override. And we can use a plain diffuse color. Sometimes it does help to add a tiny bit of saturation or a little bit of warmth to it to go into the reddish or brownish tones, just so that you don't have a bleak image. Then you don't really need to add any reflection or anything else. You basically just want to get a very plain medium texture in there, or at least a color in there, not necessarily a texture. Then within the texture slot, what does help quite often is to go in and add a V-Ray edges texture. This will just give you a hidden line view of what your render is going to look like. So this can be a charcoal to gray color with world units of either anything between 0.05 to 0.5, depending on how big your render is going to be, how much detail you need to capture, and how good your resolution is. So we're going to start off with 0.5, and we're going to make it finer or rougher depending on the results. So that is it for this lesson. I've just gone and showed you how to do a extremely quick V-Ray render setup and a override material setup. And also, just before I finish, let's not forget to actually instance the override material into the override material slot, and then once that is ready, then this material will apply to every model or every object within your scene that we will then render out in our next lesson. So hang around for the next lesson as we go and apply our cameras and lights and get our first view of our platform and of our staging area that we're going to be working on.